Hello, welcome. One of my viewers wanted me to do, and I do this from time to time about once a month, he wanted me to do a video on Pearl Harbor, the Pearl Harbor attack. So was thinking about it, and I said, I'll wait till February, and I said, all right, I'll do it. Now, the Pearl Harbor attack, December 7, 1941, there's not a whole lot to say about that in one sense. I mean, it's so well covered. I have some rolling rock here. Not the greatest thing, but on the other hand, it's what I would call a serviceable beer. It's a good standby and it's inexpensive. I buy enough craft beers, and many of them that I buy aren't that good, and I pay 2, 3, 4, 5 times the amount for them. What we do know, the conventional, or just the factual story of the Pearl Harbor attack. The Japanese Navy attacked the U.S. Army and Navy installations in in Hawaii, specifically right next to Honolulu there at the Pearl Harbor Naval Base. And 2 big aerial attacks and some naval assets attacking 2 submarines. In 2 waves. There was a 3rd wave, but they decided not to launch it. They probably should have. But the attack caused terrible destruction of U.S. military assets, damaged many battleships and other ships, some beyond repair. Most were repaired, actually, and put back into service. Killed over 2,000 men. A few civilians were killed, not really intentionally. The attack was not focused on the civilian population of Hawaii, the territory of Hawaii. And it was a big tactical success, not particularly strategic, success. In some ways, though, the Japanese realized not long after that it was a big failure, because they did damage the American Navy and Army, but mainly the Navy. They didn't cripple it. Curiously, or interestingly, however you want to use the term, or whatever term you want to use, the United States aircraft carrier fleet was not at Hawaii, conveniently enough. Or some people would say suspiciously enough, whatever, they were out on maneuvers. The Army and Navy commander at Pearl Harbor did not issue a general alert, even though they had been supposedly warned, kind of inadequately warned, to be on alert. But and they got in a lot of trouble, were court-martialed. But not only did the Japanese attack Hawaii, they also made big attacks on Wake Island, Guam, the British territories out in Southeast Asia. And initially it was a big success, and the Japanese were able to take over a lot of territory in the Pacific. Didn't do them a whole lot of good in the long run, though. They were facing off against the British Empire and the United States, who those two empires, 2 big world powers, were much stronger than Japan. It might have bought Japan a little time, but realistically, their chances of winning a war like that were small. And just 3 years later, 1944, Japan was being crushed from all sides. They were only having a little bit of success in China, taking over land, but losing a lot of men and a whole lot of money, a whole lot of material. So what did Japan gain from the Pearl Harbor attack? Not a whole lot. Got the American people all riled up against them. It dealt a knockout blow to the non-intervention faction in America that didn't want to get involved in the war. But just knowing the facts about Pearl Harbor, how many ships were sunk, which ones were repaired, how many men were killed, at what time the attacks occurred, what air bases were hit, all that. Those are good to know, but they don't mean you understand it. A lot of times knowing facts about history doesn't mean you understand actually the history. So to understand Pearl Harbor, you have to go back in time a little bit. It's really necessary. So let's take a little trip back in time. You go back to 1853. Now, in 1853, 87 years before that attack, Japan was a relatively backward country, insular. They were not interested in taking over territories around the world. They were definitely neutral in foreign conflicts. Their technology was low, and their threat to world peace was nil. Okay, but what was happening in the 1850s in Asia? We have the European encroachment into Asia. The Russians spreading eastward. Well, they had spread eastward already, but they were spreading more, even more, into China. The British, who had been grabbing pieces of China since 1839. Then the French get involved. The Portuguese had been out there since the 1500s. The Germans, after the 1880s, in the 1880s, start getting involved in China. So China was a very screwed up country. They had a lot of internal problems, exacerbated by imperialism and the British desire to sell dope, literally dope, opium, in China. The Opium War, 1839. So you have all these internal problems in China, and China starts being chopped apart by the Europeans. And there wasn't much China could do about it. They tried to resist at some points in time, but they failed. Meanwhile, across the Sea of Japan, there's little Japan, sort of like oblivious in a way to what's happening. Just want to be left alone. But it didn't matter if they wanted to be left alone, because in 1853, the U.S. Navy under Commodore Perry shows up under orders from President Millard Fillmore. And their posture was threatening. The Japanese took it as a threat. They felt very intimidated by the U.S. Navy, who they could not compete against in any way. So they eventually signed this treaty of trade with the United States and friendship, although they didn't feel like it was a treaty of friendship. They felt like it was a treaty signed at the barrel of a gun. Anyway, they signed it. Okay, now, Japan had for centuries been under the control of a shogunate, a dictatorship. They had emperors, but the emperors had no real power. They were really tools of this Tokugawa family that ran Japan. And they were just like medieval rulers. They didn't want to advance. They were wealthy. They had no reason to change. They were ultra conservative. They didn't want to modernize Japan. But this American appearance with the Navy freaked out a lot of Japanese. They got really scared. And so you start having this struggle between the ones that never wanted to change and the Japanese who said, we have to change, we have to modernize, or we'll become a colony like Indochina, Cambodia, Laos, Vietnam. Like China's becoming, Indonesia has become Malaysia, Malaya, Borneo, the Philippines. So in 1867, this struggle came to a head, and the modernists, the progressives, took over Japan. And they said, the emperor is going to rule. The emperor wasn't really ruling, but it was the pro-emperor faction, the nationalists, really. They're going to use the emperor as a tool to unify the people. Similar to what happened in Germany, where the emperor, the Kaiser, unifies the people in this nationalist fatherland type thing. All right, so 1867, the Japanese decide we do not want to be a colony. We don't really want to interact with the world, but if we have to choose between being a colony or modernize, and we'll go ahead and modernize. So Japan went on this crash course, modernizing their country, building up a strong military, navy, and army. And they went to Europe for help. So they hired a bunch of retired British, mainly, and German officers to come modernize their navy and their army. And they basically just copied people's navies. They didn't worry about plagiarization. They just said the British have good ships. We'll just copy them, make the same thing. And they started to send their students all over the world to go to school, go to America and go to college, learn English, learn French, learn German. They're not sending these students to Paris, London, Vienna, Berlin, New York, and San Francisco to take drama, theater, drama classes or major in fine arts. No, they're going to go to the Western countries to learn engineering, chemistry, practical sciences, and not for no reason either. So they go back to Japan. They start to build up this country. And I mean, it worked fast. 1877, 87, 97. So in about 30 years, Japan had become, incredibly modern relative to what they were 30 years before. But in a way, it's sad because Japan modernized their country in order to resist the imperialists, but they became infected with the same illness, the same sickness of imperialism and ambition. They look around and they see Russia and Germany and Great Britain and America taking over territories, and they decide, let's do that. And the first place they hit was China. Now, they attacked China in 1894. Japan and China had been enemies for a long while, but they had left each other alone, more or less. There was the Japanese-Chinese War, 1894, 1895, and the Japanese beat China pretty bad. No surprise, because China never could really modernize with their internally corrupt government. Japan's government, it might have been corrupt, but they were nationalists, and they were more concerned about the health of their country than, stealing all the time. All right. So it's sort of like a person going in a casino. They get addicted to gambling, and the worst thing they can do is win, because then they don't take the money they want and go out and invest that money and live off of it. They say, I'm going to gamble what I won and win more. You know what's going to happen there, right? Because the cards are going to be stacked against you in a casino. The house is going to win. Well, that's what Japan's going to do. They're like a gambling addict. They take over China, they take land from China in 1895. Now they should have stopped. But the appetite grows with the eating. You see a person that's overweight, they're always hungry. That's all they talk about. They're eating lunch and they're talking about supper. And that's what the Japanese, they got, like I said, infected with the same virus. They got into this conflict with Russia over Manchuria. Manchuria is a northeastern part of China. It's very wealthy, or potentially wealthy, because it's full of minerals. And the Russians were getting involved with the Chinese government. And what the Russians wanted to do was exploit that land and also build a railroad from one end of Russia to the other. And back then, Russia stretched from Poland to Korea. Still stretches from Poland to Korea, but not as big as it used to be. Not yet. Anyway, that's another story. And they wanted to, now if you look at the map, you'll see that to go around Manchuria was a long way, but if you built a railroad straight across Manchuria, it would be a good shortcut. So they made a deal with the Chinese government, and the Chinese said, okay, you could build the railroad straight across, this Trans-Siberian Railroad straight across Manchuria. Well, the Japanese wanted that land, so they told Russia, you're dipping into our territory. The Russians said, buzz off, Japs. We're out here and we're running the show. So the Russians had already set up some colonies in China, like Port Arthur, right next to Korea and right next to the Sea of Japan, and right in Japan, what Japan considered their neighborhood. So Japan kept warning Russia, get out of our get out of our sphere of influence, our zone. And the Russians looked down on Japan as a bunch of Asiatics, inferior people. And they just said, no. So in 1904, Japan, after warning Russia repeatedly, did a preview of what they were going to do later. They made a sneak attack on the Russian naval facilities in the east. Just showed up one morning. They didn't have aircraft in 1904, but they began to bombard the Russian military installations, and the Russians were totally unprepared. And for about a year, Japan and Russia were fighting, and the Japanese were beating up on Russia. This is where the United States comes in, okay? This is very important. Remember, knowing facts is good, but understanding the facts is more important. Very important here. The United States had already been involved because remember the Spanish War, the Spanish-American War of 1898. The United States attacked Spain in 1898. Why? Because Spain was a threat to the United States? Not hardly, because they wanted Spain's territory, Puerto Rico, Cuba, the Philippine Islands, Guam, okay? Spain was weak and they couldn't defend their territory, so they lost, and America took those lands. And the Philippines is where the flashpoint came, because the Philippines is close to Taiwan, and Taiwan is a Chinese island that Japan had already pretty much taken control of after the 1895 war with China. And the Philippines is right south of Taiwan. And so the Japanese the Japanese in 1898 got really nervous, pretty much like hysterical about it. Like, here's the United States, got Russia coming from the north, and here's the United States coming from the south and the east. So this is going to cause like endless problems. But back to Russia. So Japan tears Russia up pretty bad. And in fact, it was so bad that socialist groups in Russia figured this was their chance to overthrow Russia in 1905. The communists tried to overthrow Russia in 1905. Came close. But there were enough anti-communist forces in Russia that they launched a huge counterattack, and they started to massacre all the communists in Russia. And then you had these huge pogroms across Russia, killing thousands of Jews, who the Russians viewed as being the catalyst for communism. So then you started having a widespread Jewish immigration from Russia to America. That's another story. Get off of that. Russia was able to survive the communist revolution for about 12 years, until they stupidly got involved in World War I. Another story. All right, back now. One thing you have to consider, when Japan was beating Russia, at first they were really jumping on them hard. But as time went on through 1904, 1905, they started to lose momentum, and then you could start to see that Japan was not as strong as initially perceived, that they weren't really going to beat Russia in the long run. Lucky for Japan, they caught a good break when Russia had the revolution, or the aborted revolution of 1905, because Russia started to counterattack against Japan in 1905. And you wonder what would have happened to them when that massive Russian momentum began to bear down on the East. But it didn't happen, because who got involved in 1905? Well, the United States got involved in 1905, Roosevelt. Now, if you just look at the facts, you'd say the United States was so kind-hearted that Theodore Roosevelt got involved to bring peace to Russia and Japan, a neutral country. He brought them to Portsmouth, New Hampshire, the Russian representative, the Japanese representative. They had to sit down and they worked it out. Russia ceded some islands to Japan, Sakhalin, half of Sakhalin Island, the Kuril Islands, and some other areas in China to Japan. They paid Japan penalty money, indemnity, and they called the war off. Not that Russia would ever let something slide like that. Russia's not a country that ever forgets an insult. So they just said, okay, Japan got us for now. And they just put that on the shelf under the to take care of later category. Anyway, why was the United States so keen to intervene in the Russian-Japanese conflict? Because the United States was kind-hearted, or there was more to the story? Well, you know the answer. There was more to the story. Roosevelt was extremely worried about Japan. And when the Japanese did their big attack on Russia, he got very, very scared. And he was looking at the map, and a fool could look at the map and see this is close to the Philippines. This is a very bad problem. And if anybody's going to run Asia, it's going to be us or Great Britain, not Japan. So he was very worried about that. So that's why he really got involved in bringing the peace to Russia and Japan. And he did win the Nobel Prize for Peace for that. All right. Anyway, 2 years later, 1907, Roosevelt launches this great white fleet across the world on a world tour. This is a new American fleet. They call it the Great White Fleet because it was painted white. And they're going to make this trip around the world, this modern American fleet. They went to Tokyo and visited on a friendly visit, ostensibly a friendly visit to Japan. We know it wasn't really friendly. We know in private messages, Roosevelt was basically saying, I'm sending that big Navy to Japan to visit Tokyo to scare the Japs. This is really his intention. This big American Navy is going to show up in Tokyo, and it's going to tell the Japanese basically, don't screw with us, because this is what you're going to get. It didn't really work. The Japanese didn't take it as, oh, we have to watch out for America. They took it as, okay, now we're pissed. They knew what it meant, and they didn't like it. So they said, okay, you got a big Navy? That's fine. We'll build a big Navy too. So that did not work out, this attempt to intimidate Japan. Okay, let's fast forward 7 years. World War I breaks out. That's a whole nother story. The British and their allies go and jump on Germany and their allies. Germany was weak relative to Great Britain and their allies, so we know they lost. Fine. Japan jumped in. Why would Japan jump into a war involving European countries who they didn't even, the Japanese didn't even like the Europeans? Well, there's only one reason. Well, there's a technical reason. They had an alliance with Great Britain in 1902 to help the British if they ever got into a war. Well, that was only the British had cooked that up to go against Russia, because the British had been in a Cold War with Russia since Napoleon had been defeated in 1815. The war turned hot a few times. But the Japanese didn't care about that treaty. The Japanese jumped into World War I for only one simple reason. That was to grab German territory in the East, because they knew Germany was under the gun, and there was no way they could defend or protect their territories. They were pretty extensive territories in the East. So the Japanese jumped into World War I on the side of the Allies and began to grab every single German territory in the East that they could get their hands on. The Marshall Islands, the Caroline Islands, the German territories in China. And they did pretty much nothing to help the Allies in Europe. Sent a few troops, fought some battles, but essentially did nothing to help the Allies, because they didn't care what happened to the Allies. If the Germans and the British annihilated each other in Europe, even better. So it was all upside for Japan. The Europeans could massacre each other in Europe, and the Japanese could grab anything they wanted in Asia. But they grabbed too much. They decided during World War I, hell, we'll just attack China while we're at it. But China was an ally too. And in 1917, when the Japanese decided to start grabbing Chinese land during the war, all the Allies teamed up against Japan and told them, you have to stop this. What are you doing? It's really scared the British and the Russians to some extent, and the Americans. Well, the Japanese were not strong yet, like they wanted to be. So they backed down. Okay. Fine. They gave the land back to China. No big problem. They were an ally. But even the Allies knew Japan was no real ally. And what did we find out in early 1917? Well, we know that the Germans had been talking to Japan during the war, their enemy. The Germans were very practical. The Japanese had taken their islands and their Chinese mainland territories. No big deal. The Germans had bigger things to worry about, like their survival in Europe. So the Japanese talked to the Germans talked to the Japanese and Mexico, and they said, "Look, probably going to get into this war with America coming up soon. Woodrow Wilson's really giving us a hard time, and if we get into a war with America, you might want to switch sides and join us. You could take over the Philippines and Malaysia and French Indochina and etc. You might want to look at that. Telling the Mexicans they could have Texas, New Mexico, Arizona. Mexico and Japan were not necessarily unappreciative of the offer and were fairly interested in it. But the British, being the British, intercepted the telegrams and let the news media get a hold of it. And so, you know, that blew up. And the Japanese said, "Oh, no, no, we would never dream of entertaining such a ridiculous offer." Of course, the Allies said, "You didn't let us know you were being offered this deal." And it was sort of like The Godfather Part 2. The Japanese tell the British and the Americans, "What do we have to tell you about every offer we turn down?" But that tells them right there, this is not, you know, this is a little scary. I have a book from 1916, The New Map of Europe. And this British author talks about the Japanese joining the war. And it's interesting, to say the least. And he, I highlighted it somewhere in here. The book is very anti-German. So, I mean, you got to take that into account. I mean, it is, you know, it's a British author. So you got to look at it like that. But he talks about Japan entering the war. And he says here in the book that the Japanese entered the war so that they could get a hold of German islands. I can't remember where it is. It's in this book. I can certainly prove it to you. But he says that the Japanese entered the war simply to get hold of the German islands to be used in a possible future war against the United States. This man is saying this in 1916. Okay, so in 1916, I kept this book. Well, I bought it because it was cheap, but I highlighted that and I said, I'll never get rid of this book. Because here he's saying in 1916, you hear what I'm telling you? That Japan has joined World War I so that they could seize German islands to build naval bases to use in a possible future war against the United States. Okay, now, okay, World War I ends. China becomes a republic. Well, actually, that happened before World War I, 1912, but China was in total chaos. I mean, they had Chiang Kai-shek, and he was the first president of China, and he was good at overthrowing the emperor, but I don't know how good he was at running China. But, you know, he tried. He was trying to make China strong, but all these different factions were trying to rule China, and it was total chaos. I mean, China couldn't rule itself. So you know what's going to happen. Japan and the Soviet Union, who took over Russia in 1917, the communists, the Reds, they're going to try to manipulate China any way they can and grab whatever land they can. So you got the Soviets supporting Mao Zedong because they want China to become communist, and that can be a country that is going to bow down to the Soviet Union, which they did in some ways until 1960. Mao did. And then you got Japan saying, oh, well, here's chaos in China. Let's take advantage of it, which is what they did. After World War I, there were some very serious naval conferences in Washington, D.C. between the United States, Great Britain, Germany, United States, Great Britain, France, Italy, and Japan. 2 different naval conferences. And what was the reason for the conferences? Well, they said it was to reduce armaments. You want a naval armaments reduction, which would help bring peace to the world, because they said one of the things that led to the World War, the First World War, was an arms race. But that's not really what caused World War I. But anyway, they're playing this little psychological game, which Japan has not fallen for. The real reason for the armaments conference was because they were scared of Japan getting this huge navy, and they wanted to limit Japan's navy. So it's sort of like Italy, Great Britain, France, the United States team up against Japan and say, you need to reduce your naval, you need to limit your naval armaments production. You know what I mean? Japan said, okay. So there was this agreement in the 1920s where the United States and Great Britain would have the two biggest navies. This is a ratio. It's set up as a ratio. And then you would have France and Japan down in the second tier, and then Italy. The Japanese signed it. They signed it because they didn't want to go to war with the Allies, really. But they didn't like the treaty because even the Japanese representative in Washington said it was sort of like, the ratio was sort of like Cadillac, Chevrolet. That's the remark he made. Cadillac, Chevrolet. But they went along with it. They never intended to follow it. And what Japan immediately started to do was, okay, we can only have, and it's the way it was written, if you look at the naval agreements, the way it was written was Japan could only have so many ships relative to what America and Great Britain had in France. And they could only make aircraft carriers, aircraft carriers were not part of this treaty because they weren't even conceived much at the time. So that's one way they got around it. They built this huge aircraft carrier fleet. They were focusing on battleships in the early 1920s because that was seen as the premier ship. We found out in 1941 it was not. But, okay, so you could only have a battleship of so many tons. It could only be so big. But the Japanese found out ways around it. They built a big aircraft carrier fleet, which became the premier ship. Okay, it wasn't even in the treaty. Secondly, they built what are called pocket battleships. They fall within the limits. Okay, like you can only have a ship this big, the tonnage. But all they did was they took a ship of a certain tonnage and they outfitted it with armaments that would make it more powerful than a ship that might be a lot bigger. So they basically signed the agreement, but they never followed the spirit of the agreement. They're going to go around it the whole time, and they're going to continue to build this extremely powerful naval force all throughout the 1920s and 30s. The United States knew they weren't following the treaty, really. So did the British. And so this tension continues to build. Now, on the surface, the United States and Great Britain are telling the Japanese, I'm glad we could work all our problems out. And the Japanese are saying, aren't we glad too? But it wasn't working out at all. It reached a head in 1931 when the Japanese got into another conflict with China. And the Japanese said China started, and the Chinese said Japan started it. But they attacked Manchuria, which is what they always wanted anyway. And China's military was weak. And so the Japanese beat the hell out of China, and they took over all of Manchuria. And China did what they were supposed to do, what Woodrow Wilson taught them to do. They went to the League of Nations and said, we've been attacked. Now, anybody who joined the League of Nations promised that they would never attack a fellow member. The Japanese said, we didn't attack. China attacked us. We were using self-defense. And I see that's what it said in the League of Nations charter. You could fight in self-defense, but you could never start a war. And then the Kellogg-Briand Pact of 1928 said, countries in all the countries of the world signed this, basically Germany, Japan, the United States, Italy, Great Britain. We would never attack each other, but we could, of course, use self-defense. So if you notice, after 1928, all the countries that go around attacking each other, they always say, we're not going to war. We're defending ourselves. When the United States attacked Iraq in 2003, they said, we're not attacking Iraq. Of course, that would violate the Kellogg-Briand Pact, where and Iraq was a signatory, and so was the United States. We promised to never go to war with each other. This is not an attack. This is self-defense, which is, of course, ridiculous. But even Germany said that when they attacked Poland, Germany and the Soviet Union. We're not attacking Poland. They started it. They started it. So that's what Japan said. China started it, and we just happened to have 60,000 troops and tanks and planes on the border. And so we fought back. They never declared war on China. They said it was, it was just this little incident. Well, the League of Nations said, okay, we'll investigate, see what happened. So the League sent a team of investigators to Manchuria. They investigated it. They went back to the League of Nations in Switzerland, and they issued a report saying, no, Japan is making this up. They chose to attack China. Japan is the aggressor, and Japan must immediately evacuate Manchuria and pay so much money to China, whatever, reparations. The Japanese threw down their papers at the meeting, and they walked out of the meeting, and Japan said, we've never been so insulted, and we quit the League of Nations. And the Japanese established a new country in Manchuria called Manchukuo, with the old Chinese emperor who had been thrown out of office in 1912, Puyi. Puyi became the emperor of Manchukuo, a new country, but really ruled by Japan. What did the League of Nations do to Japan after this? There wasn't much they could do. They didn't really want to go to war with them. They just they were hoping that Japan would go away. Okay, now think about this. Japan has been in that casino now since 1894. They played roulette in 1895, 495, and they won. They played blackjack in 1904 and 1905, and they won again. Now they, at that poker table in 1932, 31, 32, they play again, they win. Now you go in that casino and you win 3 times, you better get out of that casino, and I mean you better get out quick with all your earnings. Now the best thing Japan could have done was get out, and I mean get out now. But does a drug addict ever give up the heroin? Does a gambler ever get out of the casino? Not until they've shot the wad. So we know what Japan does. They decide, well, heck, getting a big chunk of China was nice. Let's get all of it. And then they make the disastrous decision in 1937. Once again, they said an incident occurred at the Marco Polo Bridge on the border of Manchukuo in China. The Chinese said Japan started, Japan said China started. Who knows? I mean, really, what difference does it make? Japan just happened to have a huge invasion force ready, and they invaded China. They never declared war on China in 1937, all the way until the war ended in 1945. They never said they were at war with China. They never called it a war. They called it an incident. Japan was never officially at war with China. They were at incident with China because they said, no, we're not violating the Kellogg-Briand Pact. This is self-defense. You say, what in the hell does this have to do with Pearl Harbor? It has everything to do with it. Now, let's go back to the year 1900 with Foreign Secretary, Secretary of State Hay of the McKinley-Roosevelt administration. Now, when China did their big uprising, the Boxer Rebellion in 1900, even before that, the United States decided they were going to promote, if you want to use the word, the open door policy of China. Now, what is the open door policy? Well, it's an idea that all countries of the world will be able to trade with China openly. Now, even in 1900, they could see that in 100 years or less, China is going to be this huge trade emporium with the world. And we know today the United States and China are huge trading partners. It's this country full of resources and all these people that can make cheap toys and everything. All right, now, and so the United States wanted some of that action. So when the British and the Germans and the Russians and the Italians and everybody were, well, not the Italians, but the French and everybody were carving up China, the United States wanted to keep an open door in China. And if you want to be even more technical, as Larry Holmes would say, the United States never came up with the open door policy. That was a farce. The open door policy was developed by Great Britain, but they didn't want to come up with it because they would be seen as imperialists. So they told the United States, well, you present it and then it'll look better. So the United States said, okay. So they presented the open door policy where everybody can have a trading opportunity in China. It's just like the Monroe Doctrine, which we've heard so much about from President Monroe. There's only one problem with the Monroe Doctrine, you know, where none of Latin America will be taken over by European powers and the United States will protect Latin America from encroachment. The United States didn't invent the Monroe Doctrine. The Monroe Doctrine was invented by the British. But they felt that if they went out there and said nobody should take over Latin America, they would seem to be the bullies or the imperialists. So the British told the United States, you know, if you issue this declaration that nobody could mess with Latin America, we could both trade down there. It wouldn't look so imperialistic. So the United States said, yeah. So the Monroe Doctrine, of course, invented by the British, and the open door policy invented by Great Britain. But it looks better. It looks better when the United States issues these things. Let the child issue it, not the mother country, not the real boss. But anyway, now, all right. Anyway, going on now. Where were we? Okay, so Japan makes this terrible mistake to invade China in 1937. There's one little problem. Now, China was seen as this really screwed up place. Terrible internal problems. Can't get out of their own way. They have a communist rebel army threatening to take over. Talk about a wreck. These Chinese people can't do anything. They can't, you know. So the Japanese think, well, this will be easy. Bunch of Chinese. So Japan attacks China, and they're figuring, in a year or two, we'll take over maybe all of the country, probably not all of it, but a good hunk of it, and we'll have this huge Chinese empire to be wonderful. We'll make so much money. Oh my goodness gracious, one of the greatest mistakes in the history of the world. Japan attacks China with their army, their navy, their air force, and their marines. There's only one little problem. China had this little frustrating way of refusing to surrender. 1938 comes around, the Japanese are bombing China apart. You ready to give up? The Chinese say, not close. Yeah, but you're losing all this land. Chiang Kai-shek says, that's true, but look at all the Japanese soldiers that are being killed. And look how much money it's costing Japan. This golden opportunity was costing Japan a fortune. These wars, you see, they're so expensive. 1939 comes along, the Japanese tell China, you ready to give up now? Chinese say, nope, not even close, because we have 300, 400 million people. What do you have? We got a lot of land. The Japanese start to realize, son of a gun. We thought this was going to be easy. Now, you see, the smart thing would be, now you've gone in that casino and you're losing money. You're not winning. Just turn around and get out. Cut your losses and get out. Get out. Get out. But you see, the Japanese have this pride thing, right? This saving face. They have two choices. They can get out of that casino now. Just admit, we screwed up in China. Let them have what they have. We're getting out. Or we can save face and not be embarrassed, and maybe our whole country will be destroyed. What's the choice? Well, they would rather have their whole country destroyed than get embarrassed. Now imagine that. Imagine the psychology of a country that they would rather their country be destroyed than admit they screwed up. This, in fact, is what happened. It gets worse. Now they're fighting China, right? They can't beat them. The Chinese don't want to give up. These stupid Chinese people, can't they realize? The Japanese say, can't you realize you're defeated? The Chinese say, nope. Who's helping China? Of course, Russia's helping China. The Soviet Union is sending supplies and advisors and maybe even pilots to China. And the Russians are telling Japan, you screwed up. What do you think? We're going to let you take over China? No, fool, we're going to help China. Japan got into a very serious border war with Russia in 1939, a very serious border war, like a real war. It went on for months, and it was a conventional war involving tanks, planes, thousands of troops. That's right. Most people don't know about this war. There's another problem. Japan got their kicked. That's right. The Russians beat the out of Japan in that border war. The Japanese got real scared after that because Russia is supposed to be a bunch of chumps, and the Russians beat the out of Japan. Wow, this is getting really bad. Not only that, can they not beat China, they go and fight Russia and get their butts kicked. This war is costing them billions of dollars a month. They're losing thousands of troops a month. They're gaining nothing. They don't know what to do. Now, they're trying to figure it out. The Japanese don't know what the hell to do. Okay, well, meanwhile in Europe, France and Great Britain declare war on Germany. That's a sort of separate story. And the French get beat by Germany, okay? Well, the Japanese say, you know, if we had these air bases in the south of China, we could strike China from the south and really do a lot of damage in sort of a pincer movement. So the Japanese talk to France and say, you know, how about you let us have control of French naval and air bases in Indochina, French Indochina, Vietnam, Cambodia, and Laos. This is 1940-41. The French say, well, okay, well, I mean, what else were they going to do? They could have said no, and Japan would just take the territory outright. But they could say, no, no, France can still rule it, of course. We're just going to send troops in there as a launching pad against China. Well, France couldn't do much about it, so they said, well, okay. Now, Roosevelt, remember him? Not Theodore, we're talking about Franklin now. Now, Franklin Roosevelt says, and his people, it's always his people, you know. They're really freaked out about Japan because the Philippines is right in the middle of it. And remember the open door. What is Japan doing with the open door? They're closing it, right? They want to get a monopoly of that trade with China. So the United States chooses to get involved, right? Now, see, you know, if you watch a ridiculous movie like Pearl Harbor from 1998, it's almost like you're watching a Disney movie because there's no context to it. You know, the conventional history is the United States was just being so friendly to everyone. And then these bad Japanese people just showed up and bombed Pearl Harbor without warning. It was terrible how these Japs did this. Oh, if only that were the truth. But the reality is the United States chose to get to involve herself in the Chinese-Japanese war. And of course, on the side of China. The Japanese became very insulted. You know, Roosevelt's telling the Japanese, you better get out of China. The Japanese said, look, hey, screw off. You attack Mexico, you attack Cuba, you take over Central America, you know, you go around taking over land around the world, and now you're jumping in our game. Don't tell us what to do with China. Why don't you leave us alone, okay? But Roosevelt said, no, no, you get out of China. Stop picking on our friend, China. The Japanese said, look, I'm telling you, just really need to stay out of this, okay? I mean, the Japanese are, you got to understand, by 1940, they are pretty panicked. Their economy is going down the tubes. They're losing money left and right. They can't beat China. They're in a potential war with Russia. It's getting real bad for them. This cannot go on long term. And now the United States is jumping in. So the Japanese told the United States, you cannot get involved in this. I mean, really, this is no joke. You have got to back off. You know, get out of our game, man. Lay off. Roosevelt said, no, no, no. You know, and then when the Japanese got their air bases put in French Indochina, that's when Roosevelt goes to Congress and said, all right, now we're gonna turn the screws on Japan. We got them where we want them. So the Roosevelt administration orders an embargo with Japan, a trade embargo. No more oil sales to Japan and no more scrap metal. Well, this puts Japan in a total panic because Japan has no oil and they have no scrap metal. Japan's natural resources are minimal. If they don't get any oil or scrap metal from the United States, they lose for sure. Now, the chances of beating China are already poor. But if they don't have this trade with America, their chances of beating China are zero. So that's when Japan goes into this, what you would call total panic mode. Total panic mode. Now, there was already internal problems within Japan. You see, you had the war party, the imperialist party. Now, they're all nationalists by this time. They all want to have a strong Japan. But you have two factions. You have the war party that wants to, we're going to fight China. But then you always had this peace party telling the emperor, look what these people are doing. They're wrecking our country, man. We should never got involved in all of this. And we definitely don't need to fight the United States and Great Britain. Hell, we can't even beat China. And the emperor is, he's trying to stay alive, he's a figurehead himself in a lot of ways. So he's saying, I don't know, but it's almost like every time the peace party got strong in Japan and they were about to take over and get out, then the United States would do something to tick the Japanese people off. And then the war party would get back into control. And that's what happened when they did this embargo. Then the war party is totally in control now. And they go to the emperor and they say, okay, look, hey, screw all of this. Screw everybody. If we're going to lose to China, fine, let's lose. But we are not going to let the British and the Americans gang up on us. And we're not going to go down without fighting. They hit us, we're going to hit them back. So that's when the Japanese decided, look, we're going to hit the United States. Now, this is where they're not thinking straight, right? Okay. It's like Columbia University is going to go fight Nebraska in football. You think Columbia is going to beat Nebraska? Okay. Now, Japan was strong relative to China, but Japan was not strong compared to the United States. It's like Japan is a 10 and the United States is 100. Let's look at it in that comparison. So number 10, a country that's 10% strong is going to go fight a country that's 100% strong. Not only that, they're going to go fight Great Britain, who's also 100%. Okay, well, they were in that war with Germany, so let's say they're only 70%. You think they're going to win? No. Now, even the war party figured our chances are low of winning. But this is the mentality they have. They say, well, here's what we're going to do. Now, they totally misread the psychology of the Roosevelt administration and the American people. The Japanese, I'm talking about the war party, they come up with this, they concoct this plan. Okay, now here's the madcap plan. We're going to hit the United States at Pearl Harbor. And we're going to hit the British in Malaysia, and we're going to hit the Dutch down in Indonesia. And we're going to hit them so hard that they're going to realize that they screwed with the wrong people. And then the British and the Americans are going to come to the table, and they're going to negotiate a peace settlement with us and get off our damn back and let us go fight the Chinese. Now, this is the flight of fancy that the Japanese are entertaining at this time. Now, some of the Japanese peace party said, are you insane? Are you crazy? The Roosevelt and Churchill want you to fight them anyway, because, Roosevelt needs an excuse to get into the war. He's looking to get involved. Beyond that, you have no chance of beating the United States. But no, that's what they think. They're going to hit the Americans so hard that they're going to say, okay, we're sorry. We're sorry. We didn't mean to start it with you. Let's talk. Let's negotiate. Imagine how ridiculous that is. Okay, I have a book from 2001. It's called Pearl Harbor Extra. Now, this is fascinating because this guy here, he gets a bunch of old newspaper articles, right, of what was happening in 1941. Now, you see, here's a newspaper article from the San Francisco Examiner, 1926. Secret plans of Japanese general staff preparing for war with a Western power. Okay, so here's 1926, a big feature article about how the Japanese were planning to go to war with a Western power, more than likely the United States. Here's Monday, December 1st, 1941. FDR rushes to Capitol, Far East crisis grave. Okay, so all through the summer and fall of 1941, it was pretty well known that the Japanese and the United States were on thin ice and that a war could break out at any moment because the Japanese were openly threatening to attack the United States and Great Britain. Openly. But they said, no, we'll negotiate, you know, but we know they were making a secret mission to attack Pearl Harbor and they were only going to negotiate as a cover. Here we go, December 3rd, 1941, FDR, Dallas Morning News. FDR asked Japan why troops sent to Indochina. You know, here's Roosevelt saying, why are you sending troops to Indochina? Common sense, we know why. Here we go, December 5th, 1941, the Des Moines Register. Action likely in Pacific. Action likely in Pacific. And if you read the whole article, they pretty much detail, it looks like the Japanese are going to attack in the Pacific at any moment. Okay, here we go, December 5th. Japs answer today, break near. December 5th, 1941. In other words, it's about to blow. This was not a big shock. Everybody was waiting, not are the Japanese going to attack, when and where. Here we go, December 7th, 1941. The Honolulu Advertiser, the morning of the attack. People have this in their driveway the day of the attack. Not only are the Shriners going to stage a colorful grid show, FDR will send message to Emperor on war crisis. Japanese deny massing troops for Thai war. Hirohito holds power to stop Japanese army. Okay, so it's not like this was a surprise attack, really. It was everybody's figuring the attack is imminent. Here we go, Baltimore American, same day, December 7th. Headlines, Roosevelt sends personal message to Jap Emperor. 0 hour over the Orient. Okay, this is the actual date, December 7th. Headlines, big, bold, black letters. Zero hour, okay? Soviet envoy arrives in U.S. And then, of course, war Oahu bombed by Japanese planes. Well, you know, they've only been threatening to attack for about a year. Okay, so, you know, this is really important because, you know, we know the events of Pearl Harbor. The Japanese realized, their high command realized when they examined the attack, they realized they had really lost because they didn't bomb any of the oil facilities. There was extensive petroleum facilities on Hawaii. They never bombed them. That could have really could have crippled the American war effort in the Pacific for a good little while. They were untouched, and they were able to immediately use this. It wasn't that long before the U.S. was able to rebuild their naval strength. And let's think about this. December 1941, the Japanese make this huge attack all around this ring of Asia. Go a year later, December 1942. They're already losing. So what did they gain? A few months. Japan was losing the war when they attacked Pearl Harbor in 1941. They were losing to China. I mean, no, China wasn't anywhere close to taking over Japan. China wasn't even able to get the Japanese out of their own country. But it was a stalemate. The Japanese were unable to make the Chinese surrender. And of course, the Chinese were unable to kick the Japanese out of China. But we have big time, you know, there was a whole array of forces involved. In Japan, I'm not excusing Japan. They did it to themselves. It's on them. Too bad. I'm only saying the whole point of this whole long video on Pearl Harbor was that, let's think about it. Maybe if the United States Navy had not shown up in Japan in 1853, you know, maybe Japan would have stayed isolationist, backwards. Oh, well, maybe none of this stuff would have happened. So what's the lesson of all of this? Could the lesson be leave other countries alone? Don't dip into people's neighborhoods. Don't bother the hell out of people. I don't know. What is the message? It's interesting though, and it is important to know that there's always a background to a story. So thank you for watching this video production.